How are they getting the energy to start with? It seems like they're getting the energy from the macronutrients.
The evolving human only did enough exercise to get the food to provide the energy to survive another day. That's what we lived on. But then we killed out all the elephants and we killed out all the mammoths. And then we had a problem, because now where were we going to get the food from? That you've got mainly a carbohydrate-based diet. And that's not what we evolved to eat. We evolved to eat high fat, high protein. Once you exercise at more than 85% of your maximum, you can't burn fat. You can only burn carbohydrate.
Sir, welcome to Run with Fitpage. It's our weekly show, and as we were discussing earlier, it's a show where we get to host legends like you, and we get to learn so much about the science of exercise, the science of nutrition. And on behalf of all of our listeners, I wholeheartedly thank you for being with me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you. Such a fan I am personally of your work, and together with me, I'm sure most of our listeners, they already are aware of your work, your books, the research papers, a lot of content that's been produced over a period of last 4 or 5 decades, to be honest. And there are some who are very interested in knowing how you got interested in exercise science to start with.
Well, that's a great question to start with. So I was at high school and I had a great interest in science. I then was fortunate to go to America for a year as an exchange program student. And it was while I was there, the South African surgeon from Cape Town, Christian Barnard, performed the world's first human heart transplant in my town. And I, for some reason, woke up 3 months later in America and my brain said, "You must study medicine." So I said, okay, I listened. So when I got back to Cape Town, I started studying medicine. And at the same time, I started doing endurance sports, mainly rowing. And then eventually from rowing, I went into running. And I became fascinated by the physiology of exercise. And I recall that one day we had the visiting coach from the British Olympic rowing team. And he went up to the board and he said he drew a graph like this, and he said, The reason you feel so bad at 2,000 meters is because your blood lactate level has gone through the roof, and that makes you feel terrible. And I literally walked out of that lecture, that was 1969, and said, that's what I'm going to study. And so that's what I did. And fortunately, my personality is such that I wasn't going to be a really great doctor, because I'm more interested in discovering things than learning what's already known. And so I set out to study sport and the science of sport and medicine. And I first did my PhD in medicine. And then when I'd finished, it was very fortunate because sports science was really taking off globally. And the university appointed me as a lecturer in sports science. And I was able then to grow the field in the university and in South Africa. And it was great because in those days you could know everything about sports science. Today, it's impossible because we've now become highly specialized, and you can't really understand everything. So I was very fortunate, and I had a great career of 40 years teaching in the sports sciences. Then I ran into trouble because I discovered I was type 2 diabetic, and I changed my diet to a low carbohydrate diet, and magically helped. I didn't completely cure myself. I do have to take some medication, but I improved my control of my diabetes dramatically, so that I'm in remission, as they call it. So I started promoting the low carb diet, and the profession didn't like that at all. And so I got charged with promoting misinformation, as it were, and disgraceful conduct as a doctor. And I was charged by the Health Professions Council of South Africa, which is the highest body controlling medical practice. So I went to court for 4 years, and we were in court for 28 days. And I gave evidence over 9 days, and then I was cross-examined for 3 days. So it was quite something. And the person who saved me was Dr. Rocky Ramdas, a Hindu Indian, South African. And we are like this. I mean, he taught me all about the Hindu religion, and we would speak to Ganesha every morning before the trial. He was spectacular. He cross-examined me, to teach me how to cope with cross-examination. And literally in 5 minutes, my tongue would be so tired, I couldn't answer him anymore. But we had a great time because he led all my evidence. And we just loved it. And anyway, in the end, we won 13-0. We won 13 decisions against 0. They even appealed the case and we beat them again on the appeal. It was complete rubbish. But despite that, what I proved that the low carbohydrate diet is very, very safe and very effective. It hasn't been changed. The medical training in South Africa is still exactly the same as it was. No one took any notice of what had happened, which is pretty sad. And if you look at the record, I'm the second doctor to be charged like that. There was a lady in Sweden who was charged. And since then, there have been 4 or 5 more doctors. And we've all won the case. And we've all, right. But it's been really interesting. And it was life-changing for me. And if I hadn't discovered the low-carb diet, we wouldn't be talking today. I would be in my grave long ago.
Awesome. We are fortunate that we are speaking with you. And I say this on behalf of everyone who is listening to this, because you're so right that if there is any truth in misinformation, then that should be corrected. But if it is the right information, then someone who charged should be correcting themselves. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. But I think from the conversation today, some more of us can be informed about what exactly it is and how does it really help. And I would seek your help to go through that in detail. But before we get to that, what I wanted to start with was right from the very base, which is when we grow up, we hear of macronutrients, we hear of nutrients, we hear of carb, fat, protein, and it just seems like there are 2 things, at least I can say in India, where 2 things we are not great at. One is financial literacy, and second is exercise science and nutrition literacy. Yeah. We are very good in studies, engineering, everything else. But these 2 things, I think we are not great as financial planners. And I think that's a global phenomenon and issue as well. So if I ask someone, what is a calorie to start with? I will find different answer. And most people will be like, yeah, it's written on the back of the food that I bought, but I exactly don't know what is a calorie. And then some will say, yes, it's energy, it's a unit of energy, which is good, that it starts to get to truth. But I wanted to start right from there. Why humans need energy or calories for that matter? How is it all just coming together? And why is it called calorie to start with? And then we get to macronutrients, then we get to carbs.
Okay, as I understand it, a calorie is the amount of energy that needed to heat 1 gram of water 1 degree centigrade. So it's a measure of energy. Why do we need energy? Well, to do everything that we do. Our body needs to convert the food, the energy in the food that we eat into energy which it stores in the body, and then it releases as we need it. And it's absolutely critical because human evolution and animal evolution is determined by how much energy we have in the diet. And interesting that humans are generally, we're very reluctant to spend energy, because until we've got all these labor-saving devices, humans had to be very cautious about how they spent their energy. So, for example, the evolving human only did enough exercise to get the food to provide the energy to survive another day. So that's what we lived on. What's happened now is, of course, it's easy for us to get the energy. And so that's why we get obese. But there was no obesity beforehand, because just to survive, you had to do just enough to get the energy that will get you through the next day. And that was tough. That required us to save energy. When we weren't expending energy, we saved it. So if you look at traditional societies, they weren't very active, which is quite contrary to what we believed. They didn't go out and run marathons, because if they did, they would have died, because they wouldn't have had enough energy to do the rest of the stuff. It's only because we've got so much food availability now that we can afford to go and run marathons and be very physically active. So it's an interesting point that we don't understand. Humans are actually designed to be very cautious with how we spend our energy.
Now, if that's the case, that humans are very cautious how to spend energy, it seems like that is why I see a lot more obese people
Yeah.
because they're not spending the energy,
That's right.
is how I understand. But how are they getting the energy to start with? It seems like they're getting the energy from the macronutrients.
Yeah.
And these are nutrients that are coming from everything that we consume. Isn't that right?
Yeah. So the three macronutrients are carbohydrates, fats, and protein. And when we were 3 to 4 million years ago, we were still just getting out of the trees and getting onto the ground in Africa. And what happened was that there was a climate change, and so it opened up the savanna. And so if you were living in the trees on the edge of the savanna, all of a sudden you had a problem because you couldn't get all the food that you were normally eating. And so early ancestors realized that they had to live off what was on the savanna, and that was meat. And so we started killing animals. And even though we were tiny, somehow we managed to kill or scavenge, originally scavenge, and then ultimately, as we got weapons and so on, we were able to catch these animals. I suspect early on we mainly ate small prey, the babies, etc., of the antelope and so on. But so we evolved on a high-fat, high-protein diet and did extremely well. And that's why we could go. And then we went north from Africa into Europe, which was very cold. And we started to eat living off elephants and mammoths. And that was good because there had a lot of fat on them. And that's great because that provides you a lot of calories, and which is what you need. And also you've got lots of calories, you can have a bigger population. But then we killed out all the elephants and we killed out all the mammoths. And then we had a problem because now where were we going to get the food from? And then in the Middle East, the fertile area there, the agricultural revolution started about 18,000 years ago. And that's when we started eating the grains. And that was to provide the energy that we weren't getting from these fat animals anymore. Now, the problem was we'd been evolving over millions of years to eat protein and fat. We weren't evolved to eat carbohydrate. And that's the essential problem, and particularly in your country, that you've got mainly a carbohydrate-based diet. And that's not what we evolved to eat. We evolved to eat high fat, high protein. Now, what happened in the 1970s was that the American Heart Association decided to tell us that a saturated fat diet's bad for us, and we should cut out all saturated fat, and we should eat vegetable oils, and we should eat lots of carbohydrates. And that's when the problem really starts. We got humans who are not adapted to eating carbohydrates, who now must eat carbohydrates, but then they become refined and they become highly addictive. And if I can tell you one piece of information, the most important piece of information, is that obesity is caused by food addiction. That's the key. The reason why people take in too many calories is not because they're lazy, it's because they're addicted to the sugary diet, the ultra-processed food diet. And I didn't know this until a few years ago. Our foundation started getting lecturers and listening to other people. And then it became very clear to me that food addiction, and particularly sugar addiction, is the real problem. And until you get rid of the food addiction, you can't bring your calories down to what you need, and to only what you need. And that's the real problem. So what was really interesting, when I wrote the first book on the diet, a lot of people changed their diets in South Africa and started eating a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. And some of them cured their diabetes. And they would write to me, and we then went and examined. I think we had 30 people who claimed that they had reversed their type 2 diabetes just by reading the book. Notice, not by going to the doctor.
Wow.
Not by going to doctors, because if they'd gone to the doctors, they would have got a different advice. So anyway, we brought them to Cape Town and we tested them, and we found, yes, there was a majority of them were true. They had reversed their diabetes, were the ones who hadn't reversed their sugar addiction. And it was as simple as that. As soon as you get rid of your desire to eat this bad food, you can reverse your diabetes. But that requires you to cut your carbohydrate intake dramatically. It's like being an alcoholic. You can't drink one beer or alcohol drink And it's like a smoking. You can't smoke one cigarette because you just go straight back again. It's exactly the same with sugar and ultra-processed food. You can't have one meal of those foods that you're going to be back again. And it's the people who are disciplined who can reverse their diabetes. And the idea that you must go out and exercise more, that just makes you hungry. And then you eat the same food anyway, so that you're just recreating the problem.
Right. It's a loop that you keep going in over and again. And so one question out of curiosity, did they also not grow to start having fruits? Because that's also a lot of carbohydrate.
Yes, correct. You see, vegetables comes around only 10,000 years ago. We didn't have vegetables then. And the fruits that we had in the wild were small, fibrous, and very bitter. They're not like the apples and the peaches
Today.
and the plums that you eat today, which are designed to be incredibly sweet and highly addictive. So
Right.
that's the problem.
Right.
See, humans were rewarded for taking in sugar because it was high in calories and you would store it as fat. That was the key. So in the winter, you'd eat the honey particularly, or
Right.
berries, and then you'd put on weight, and that get you through the winter when there was no other food. So humans there's a built-in reason why we like sugar, why it's so addictive.
How about the science that says, when I read about micronutrients, what I have understood that the primary role of carbohydrate is to give you energy quite quickly. The primary role of protein is to give you muscle energy, and the primary role of fat is to protect you, right? How has that come about in that case?
Well, what happened was that exercise science, as I said, starts in the 70s, where it
Right.
really becomes much more popular, and you could go to a laboratory and be tested to see what you should be eating and so on. And that comes at a time when Western Europe and North America is already adapting a high carbohydrate diet. If you go back to the 50s and the 40s, the athletes were eating high fat, high protein diets. They weren't eating high carbohydrate diets, but they weren't being tested in laboratories. So no one knew that once you changed to a high carbohydrate diet, your metabolism completely changed. So what happens in the 1970s? All these laboratories spring up, and they've got to prove that they're important. And so they start studying human exercise physiology. And one of the first things they notice is that when you exercise more vigorously, you start to burn fat exclusively. And so all the textbooks say this, that once you exercise at more than 85% of your maximum, you can't burn fat. You can only burn carbohydrate. And
That's
they
correct.
come up,
Yeah.
and then they must explain that. So they say, well, you see, it's because fat, it just takes far too long to get into the metabolic pathways. Whereas carbohydrate slips in and burned quickly, gives you lots of energy.
Yeah.
So that is the textbook. And when I wrote my previous editions of my book, Law of Running, I was there. I was preaching this. This is what we call settled science. We all know it's true. When I changed my diet, then I started asking the question, well, do you really need the high carbohydrate diet to run fast? And then I started noticing that, in fact, if you looked in the literature, there were examples, or people wrote to me and they said, I also changed my diet because I was pre-diabetic and it made no difference to my performance. So 8 years ago, at the end of my trial, I was approached by some scientists in America, Philip Prince in particular, and he said, would I like to collaborate with him? He wanted, let's do some physiology research. What do I think we should do? I said, let's study the high-fat diet. And let's see if you can exercise on a high-fat diet, because we'd assumed it, settled science. You see, and the trouble with settled science is no one tests it. But the whole basis of science is you go out there and you disprove something. It's not to prove something. You must test it. So I said, it's simple. Let's have guys run 5-kilometer time trials on the treadmill and see how good you are at doing that test. And it turned out they were very good. They were very reproducible. So in other words, they could put someone on the treadmill once a week and he'd produce the same result. Then that's what you've got. So you've got a stable measurement. So I said, okay, let's have them eat a high-fat diet for a period and then test them, and then a high-carbohydrate diet and test them. And we found that the 5K time trial was exactly the same. There was no benefit to the high carbohydrate diet, and there was no benefit to the high fat diet. But we published it and didn't take much note. No one took much notice of it. In fact, there were 4 other very similar studies where it showed exactly the same. So we weren't the first. There were 5 studies showing that a high-fat diet did not impair your athletic performance. But we published it. And then he said, well, what must we do next? I said, well, now we must shorten the distance, because what they'll say is a 5K time trial is too long. You're burning fat anyway, so it's no benefit. You can't really test it. So I said, okay, let's do 1 mile time trials. We did that. There was no difference. So the people could run the 1 mile exactly as fast with whatever diet they did. But then, as part of that trial, we said, we always think, okay, so what are they going to say? And what they're going to say is, oh, but you see, your athletes started with, even though they were on a high-fat diet, they had enough glycogen, carbohydrate, in their muscles that they could sprint the mile. You didn't really test the hypothesis. So I said, okay, let's do something that we know depletes your muscles of glycogen, and that's repetitive exercise. So I said, let's do 800-meter repetitions on the treadmill. We'll set the pace, and they must maintain the same pace for 6 intervals. And we'll measure their metabolism. So we did that. And guess what? No difference in performance. Now, normally, if you asked a physiologist, they'd say, oh, well, of course, by the 3rd one, they're going to be depleted of glycogen. And so that the 4th, the 5th, and on the 6th one, they're not even be able to start, because they've got no energy in their muscles. They won't even be able to do. But we did one other thing, which we hadn't actually planned, but we did anyway. We measured their metabolism during those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 intervals. And we found that on the 6th interval, they were running at 86% of their maximum. So remember, I told you, the textbook says 85% you can't burn any more fat. So we should have found that on the 6th interval, they were burning 0 fat. It turns out that they were burning more fat than's ever been measured in any human in the history of mankind. They were burning an enormous amount of fat. So, and they just burned more and more fat. So the longer they went on these intervals, the more they did, the more fat they burned. And if we'd been able to have them do 10 intervals, they would have been burning in the stratosphere. All the energy would have been coming from fat. So then we knew that you don't need carbohydrates to run fast. And so finally, what we did, and this is the paper that's just been published, which is a definitive study. It's not often in medicine you can do it, or science you can do a definitive study. And it took us 7 years to get to this point. And in essence, what we did was we again had our guys eat when they ate a high-fat diet or a high-carbohydrate diet. The same 10 athletes, that's the key. We used the same 10 athletes in these experiments. And they go on the high-fat diet for a period, and then they go on the high-carbohydrate diet for the period. And then we ask them to do an exercise, go for as long as they can, and we give them water to drink, but we tell them we don't tell them what it contains, and it tastes like it's got carbohydrate in it. So now we have them exercise, and guess what? There's no difference again. They go for exactly the same duration when they have a high-fat diet or a high-carbohydrate diet. So that tells us that the carbohydrate you store before exercise, which is what we had promoted. My book said you got to eat so many, I forget what it was, 600 or 700 grams of carbohydrate a day for the last 3 days before a marathon. We showed, made no difference. So there's no point in doing that. So then this was the key. We then had them repeat the exercise after the high carb diet, high fat diet, and we gave them a dribble of glucose, a tiny, tiny amount of glucose. Because what we wanted to do was to keep the blood glucose normal. Because when they didn't have glucose, their blood glucose fell during exercise. And we believe that's why they stopped, was because their blood glucose was falling. So we gave them just enough glucose to keep their blood glucose normal, but not to influence their metabolism in the muscles. They still burnt fat or carbohydrate depending on what diet they'd been following. And guess what? Both groups increased their performance 20% when they prevented hypoglycemia. So we proved our hypothesis
Was it then a repletion of the liver glycogen if it was not the muscle?
That's right. So you see, the reason why we were able to do these studies were we were working on a review of all the papers ever written on carbohydrate ingestion during exercise. And when you read it, things become a little bit more obvious. And the first thing that I noticed, and we'd done the studies, but we hadn't seen it. So we did experiments where we infused glucose into the bloodstream at very high rates. And we showed that the metabolism it didn't do what we expected it to do. You expect if you infuse glucose into the bloodstream that the muscle will just burn this glucose and stop everything else. It'll just burn the glucose you're infusing. It doesn't do that. It continues to burn its glucose stores in the muscles as if you weren't infusing the glucose into the bloodstream. So then we said, but therefore there's a problem. And the problem is that there are actually two stores of glucose in the body. There's one in the liver, which you mentioned, and there's one in the muscles. They're differently regulated, completely differently regulated. Now, you never read that in a textbook of physiology. They never say that. And when you're told to eat carbohydrates, they never say, actually, there are two pools, and they're differently regulated. And so it turns out that humans evolved to keep our blood glucose absolutely flat. That's the ideal. If you can do that, you'll have a long life. If it goes up, you damage your arteries, your diabetes and arterial damage. If it goes down, your brain doesn't get enough glucose and you die from brain damage. And the body is not stupid. It puts all its metabolic effort into keeping your glucose flat. Now, what do you do when you carbohydrate load? You disturb that. The blood sees this. The blood sees this huge glucose load coming in. It says, whoa, we've got a problem. We can't allow this. And it does two things. It switches off your fat metabolism and starts to use carbohydrate as the fuel. If it can't do that enough, it dumps the glucose into the muscles. Yeah. So that what we were saying was the fuel for athletes, it's not. It's a dump, in my opinion. I mean, I don't know how we prove this, but to me, it seems that that's what happens. The excess carbohydrate that you can't burn, you dump into the muscles, and then that allows you to maintain your blood glucose level without secreting excessive insulin. But with time, that happens, the problems arise, and then you type 2 diabetes and so on. If I was asked to write a scientific paper on what I think happens, I think the small glucose pool in the liver and the bloodstream is there to maintain your blood glucose level. That's all it's there for. And the carbohydrate stored in the muscles is there to help the small glucose pool do its job. It's not there to be a major fuel because you can burn fat. Fat will do whatever you want it to do. But as soon as you start eating carbohydrates, you upset the balance. And that's when you're on the road to diabetes. And it's really interesting this week, a guy called Lionel Sanders, who held the world record for the Ironman triathlon, he described the development of pre-diabetes. In fact, he has frank diabetes, but he's early stage and he'll be cured. He's fine. He can eat a low-carb diet, but he's not pre-diabetic. He's frankly diabetic, but he's at a stage where he can reverse it. In my case, I was too far gone to reverse my diabetes by dietary change. And now people are saying, oh, well, it's not really diabetic and blah, blah, blah. He is diabetic. And if he continues to eat a high carbohydrate diet, he will become frankly diabetic. The problem with us in our profession in medicine is that we diagnose diabetes far too late, when it's already well established, because we don't want to put people on insulin too early, and that's understandable. But now we have a cure, which is a low carbohydrate diet. So we don't have to wait. We tell people, once they start, the glucose control starts to be slightly impaired. We say, no, you're on the road to diabetes. You have diabetes. You must stop it and eat a low carbohydrate diet.
Wow, I have now so many questions in my in my head because I thought I just grew up reading everything wrong. It seems what I have been told all the time that fat is not an efficient source of fuel, and Also, the oxidation process, the metabolic process is longer and takes more effort. It requires oxygenated blood. Less oxygen is available when in your gut and everywhere else and in the bloodstream. So you're not able to metabolize fat as efficiently when you're working hard. Now, it seems like that doesn't seem to be the case here, and so I wanted to understand, how is it then happening? That's one question. And second question I have is, we talked about two different pathways, two different regulation mechanisms for muscle glycogen and liver glycogen. How are both of these separate, and then how are they working independently? Just for my understanding, that will be helpful.
Sure. Okay, let's go back to your first question. Now, the problem in science is when we try to understand something, we develop a model. And we say, this is how the body works. For example, the other model that we've attacked is that you run out of oxygen during high-intensity exercise, and that's why you stop, because you've got lactic acidosis and so on. Now, that's a model. And the question that we as scientists, as creative scientists, have to ask the question, what's the evidence? That's the key. You explained that you believed, and I believed, we all believed, that fat can't be burned fast. And so you have to ask, well, where's that evidence? Because that's a model. And for the model, I want someone to come up and say, this is the hard science that proves it. And there was none. There was absolutely none, except a study which was associational. And I won't get into that, but it wasn't proof. We were the first people to test the hypothesis. We said, okay, this is the model. This model predicts that if you eat a high-fat diet, you won't be able to run 5Ks or 1 mile or 6 times 800 meters. You won't be able to do it as well as if you're on a high-carb diet. We disproved it. So then the model's wrong. You have to now come up with a different model. And the whole story of, the fat is burnt more slowly, etc., and this enzyme doesn't work as fast as that enzyme, well, it's simply not true. That all we know is that explanation is wrong. So we have to reinvent or reconsider the model, and that's the key. So that's the key, is you have to see what is the model that the guy's using to explain what he's explaining, and what's the evidence for that model. Now, we've now found that the carbohydrate's only important for when you ingest it during exercise. The outcry has been enormous. Oh, but do this and that and all the other thing. No. Just look, we have shown something. It may be wrong. Of course it could be wrong. And this is how we interpret our information. We're not saying we have the final answer. But we're saying is that we've tested the hypothesis and we couldn't support it. So now what we must do, other people must come along and test it and retest it. But you mustn't say, oh, you're wrong. And because it can't be, because for 50 years we've thought something else. That's not good enough. And because every professor in the world says that this is the model and your model, you can't find what you found. We found what we found. And we did the science brilliantly. It was a perfect trial. And it may be wrong. Of course it could be wrong. But at the moment, it's got a good claim to be true because of the way it was structured. And so people must say, yes, we believe this, but there is evidence for some other way, other thinking. And Noakes and Prince and their team have produced this other evidence, and we really need to consider it seriously. So that's the answer to that question. You've got to worry when people just talk about models. The big one, which got me into real trouble, was that cholesterol causes heart disease. That is purely a model. There's absolutely zero evidence for it, none at all. And it's been disproven so often. But we never hear that because the pharmaceutical industry wants you to take a statin to lower your cholesterol. They're not going to let anyone come up and say cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease. But it's again, we reduce everything to small things, to one factor. And it's the same with carbohydrate and fuels. It's as if, you don't have to train, just drink carbohydrates or load up carbs and you'll run well. No. And then when the guy runs badly, he says, it's because I didn't take enough carbohydrate during the race. I mean, it's because you didn't train properly and you didn't get your brain right. It's training and hard effort That's what gets you to the finish line. It's not because you ate a different diet. So that's we tend to reduce things. Okay, so now I'll come back to your other question. What we find is if we feed you carbohydrate during exercise, you shut off all liver glucose production. So that the liver is saying, okay, I mustn't produce glucose because there's already too much glucose in the system, in the small pool. Right. I must stop producing glucose. And that's a big effect of insulin. It completely inhibits glucose release from the liver. So therefore, the liver is controlled. Now, everyone says, oh, well, the same must happen in the muscles. It doesn't. It's the opposite. The opposite. If you have a high insulin and you exercise, you burn more muscle glycogen, not less, more. So you've got the liver burning less and muscle burning more. And we showed that in 1994. And we completely ignored it, totally ignored it. Why? Because we were doing research to prove that you could spare muscle glycogen during exercise. So when we did an experiment that disproved it, we just ignored it. It didn't, oh no, we'll just forget that. So we showed that we infused glucose at a very, very high rate. And muscle glycogen rose, it increased. Muscle glycogen use increased. So anyone who saw that data and was not blind, and we were all blind because we were being funded by the industry. And our job was to prove that glucose and glycogen makes you go faster and better. And we spent 20 years, literally 20 years, trying to prove it. And all we did was we just inhibited fat metabolism. That's all we managed to do. With all this carbohydrate ingestion, we just made these humans dependent on carbohydrates, and they stopped burning fat. And that was all the result. And we didn't see it until years later when we went back and looked at it and had different eyes to see it. And that's the problem today. 99% of people advising you on nutrition for sport are completely blind to what's happening, what the reality is. They're blind because it's so simple. It's carbohydrate. That's all you have to have in your diet, and everything else will work out.
Now I'm, I need a little more help. That is, so if my liver glycogen is depleted, it's not the great place to be in, because for that replenishment, I need to consume some glucose. There is no other way. And if I don't consume, the implications are the body starts to shut down. Now, so it seems what I'm getting away from here, if I'm an endurance athlete and I'm training for a long time, on one particular bout, I'm say running for 3 hours, 4 hours, I do need to consume carbohydrate, but maybe in a very small amount. It seems not like 60 grams per hour or 80 grams per hour, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So in our study, we use 10 grams an hour of carbohydrate, and that's probably enough because that's what the liver is running out, about 10 grams an hour during exercise. It may be less or more in some people, but it's not 120 grams an hour that you need to replace, and that is very dangerous to ingest so much carbohydrate. You really mess up your metabolism. And anyway, at least 50% of all that carbohydrate that you ingest during exercise isn't burned. It's sitting in the gut or being turned to fat, or it's going somewhere else, but it's not being used as a fuel. So yes, you're right. The more fat adapted you are, probably the less carbohydrate you need during exercise, but 10 grams per hour, that's probably the maximum amount. It's for most of us, that's probably all you need. The body is too clever. And what happens is, let's say you go out and run for 4 hours and you don't take any carbohydrate, your blood glucose, some stage is going to start falling. But once it starts falling, the brain immediately recognizes there's a problem and makes you feel lousy and slows you down. And you never get to the point where you actually collapse because there's too little glucose getting to the blood, into the brain. It's true you may stop running, but you will never go so low that you damage your brain. Because the brain is too clever. It's not going to keep you running whilst using up all the glucose. But the key is that it starts long before your blood glucose reaches some low level. It affects your performance. And that's another point that we're showing with our research, is that as soon as your glucose starts to drop, the brain says, we have a problem, and I'm going to slow you down. And then that you slow down, and then you get the symptoms of hypoglycemia.
Just one other point here around, say, suppose I'm taking about 10 grams of glycogen per hour. How much generally the liver can process per hour? How much can be ingested and kept at the liver?
Okay, so 10 grams an hour probably would not prevent liver glucose, would probably just prevent glucose release from the liver. So if the bloodstream, if the glucose is kept normal, that tells you you're in balance. And it's very likely that the 10 grams you are taking is what's being used by the muscles and the brain and the kidneys. As that's obligatory. So what's really interesting is that it's the small glucose pool that is obligatory. It's not the large glucose pool. It's not the muscle glycogen that's obligatory. It's the liver glucose that's obligatory. And it's probably the brain is using most of that glucose. Once you become fat adapted, you can substitute some of the glucose for ketone bodies. And during high intensity exercise, lactate can also be used by the brain in preference to glucose. So 10 grams will probably keep the liver glucose the same. It won't drop. Or if it does drop, remember if you start exercise, you've probably got 100 grams of glucose there. So you can fool around. You're not going to become glucose depleted very quickly if you're taking 10 grams per hour.
Got it. But you don't need to take fat nutritively to replenish fat while you are running or doing any other exercise.
No, there's a lovely analogy, that I don't know what it's like in India, and I'm sure it's similar to in South Africa, that many of the recreational athletes running the Comrades Marathon, which is 90 kilometers, or other long marathons, ultra marathons, actually carrying a lot of fat on them. And someone drew this analogy. It's like you've got this truck tanker which is full of diesel petrol, but the engine is running on ordinary petrol, not diesel. And this person who's driving this thing has to stop every so often to fill up his tank with petrol while he's carrying all this diesel. He can't burn the diesel, and that's what's happened. So you see these relatively obese or moderately obese people, and they've got so much energy, but they can't access it. And they can't access it because their insulin levels are so high that they inhibit fat metabolism.
Another point I took away and wanted to help your attention with that was learning how to use fat as an energy source is important. It doesn't work that way that I just heard from you and I went out and I decided that, okay, now fat will be used from now on. I'm not going to but I'm not going to use carb in my training. Yeah. It will not work like that. So what's the process, how someone should go about it?
Well, that's a great question. I think it takes at least 4 weeks. We've shown at least 4 weeks before your metabolism sort of settles down. And it probably takes much longer for perfect performance. And I've spoken to some elite athletes and they took even 6 months to be able to train properly on the diet. But after 4 weeks, we can measure there's been a major change to burning fat. Dr. Louise Burke, who's one of the promoters of high carb diets, she did a wonderful study in which she found that after 5 days, elite athletes can burn fat at very high rates. Now, what that means to me is that the machinery, the metabolic machinery in the muscles is always there because humans are adapted to high-fat diets historically. But as long as you're eating carbohydrates, you're inhibiting because you've got a high insulin. That the moment you drop your insulin, she showed within 5 days, these people are burning fat at very high rates. So I think that it doesn't take as long as we think. It does take a long time for the brain to get adapted and so on. But the muscles start burning fat at high rates within 5 or 6 days if you're a reasonably trained athlete.
Got it. And does it mean that I should remove carb from my nutrition, from my diet completely and use good fat sources to consume, or should I use body's fat in the start to adapt? How should I go about it when I'm thinking of it? Currently, for example, most of the runners and other endurance athletes that I know, they will be consuming 65% at times carb, about 15% fat, and remaining will be the protein, 25%. How should it look like for us when we are starting to think of moving to a low carb and high fat diet?
Okay, so we normally promote a high-fat diet, and because that's very satiating. Most people will find that they can get over their food addiction quite quickly if they eat more fat. But for some people, too much fat doesn't allow you to lose weight, and you actually have to increase the protein intake. So I think protein has been undervalued generally, and that one
Yeah.
needs to increase the protein. And I know that's a big problem in the Indian subcontinent, because protein, animal source protein, is not really acceptable or widely used. So that is a problem, that you need more protein. The fat's a bit easier because dairy produce is so full of fat that if you can just eat dairy, that'll give you lots of fat. But if you to eat the protein, you do need meat, chicken, and other animal produce. The way we just tell people, just don't eat carbs. So in other words, just cut the carbs and replace it with meat and dairy and eggs and cheese. Obviously, that's dairy. So that's what we sort of say, and it's quite easy. If you eat very few groups of foods, get rid of the vegetables. You can have some vegetables, but they mustn't be the main source of calories, and replace them with dairy produce and meat and eggs. Eggs are amazing. Eggs are probably the best, and fish as well. If you've got a problem with meat, eggs and dairy and fish are really excellent. So, but if you continue to eat carbohydrates, you'll never really get fat adapted for the reasons that we've described.
Such an eye opener, and I think I'm going to have a lot of questions after this, and I'll take the liberty to reach out in case there are so many that need addressal. Now, I'm certain people are going to take cognizance of this conversation and start to make changes. Are there any, from your study, are there any groups or any persona that should not all of a sudden make a decision to go to the high fat and high protein diet?
I think the only people who don't need to change are those who are insulin sensitive and they're not at risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So if you are magically lucky and you belong to the 10% of the population who can metabolize carbohydrates. I remember one of my friends who was still running exceptionally at 70. He comes, he said, Tim, I never listened to you, and here I am still running incredibly fast at the age of 70. But he's the one guy. The rest are many of them had to change. For example, the greatest ultramarathon runner in South Africa, a chap called Bruce Fordyce, who won the Comrades Marathon 9 times. We worked with him on the high carbohydrate diets. And then he became pre-diabetic like me, overweight, couldn't run very well, changed his diet, and all of a sudden his running came right back. And he said to me, Tim, if you'd put me on a high-fat diet, I would have won more comrades and I would have run a lot faster.
I remember his cola story where he having cola and all of a sudden running really fast, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that's because the small glucose pool. Yeah.
That's right.
That's what he was fixing up. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we had Bruce on the podcast earlier, and he was so fantastic. Yeah. And also Professor Louise Burke was on the show as well earlier.
Well, I think she'll give you a different story than mine.
I know, yeah. So two different spectrums for sure, but very helpful to understand. I think for today, this is almost sufficient, I would think, for us to start to think in this direction. Towards the end, I only have one question. In case people are making this decision to go to high fat and high protein and low carb diet, are there any markers they should look out for if they want to prove to themselves? For example, whether it's a HbA1c that they should test before they get onto it and then see it over a period of time, or any other things that they should keep in mind that will help them validate this is working for them.
Yeah, I think the fasting insulin, now not every country measures insulin because for some reason the doctors don't prescribe it, but that's really the best. And you want your fasting insulin to be below 5. And if it's below 5, then your carbohydrate intake is probably appropriate. The second one is what you mentioned, the HbA1c, which gives you an idea of what your glucose is during the day. and that you want to be below 5.5. And again, if you've got a low insulin and low HbA1c, then your diet's appropriate for your particular metabolic state. I think you need to also look at your waist circumference and see if you've got any visceral obesity. That's one of the first markers that you're metabolically unhealthy. And you can measure HDL cholesterol and triglycerides because you want a higher HDL and a lower triglycerides. That's the only cholesterol things that you need. Measuring total cholesterol is completely fallacious because as soon as it goes above 5.00001, the doctor's going to put you on statins, and there's absolutely no evidence for that. I advise people never to measure their cholesterol, but to measure those variables that I've mentioned because they might make a big difference. And triglycerides, very important. We're currently working with some elite athletes, and it's interesting that triglycerides seem to tell you more than anything because if they're elevated, then the person's metabolism is not so great.
Got it. I think I'm going to start with myself and come back to you how I did in the next few months for sure.
Excellent.
But thank you so much, sir, for the conversation today. Very, very valuable. And I will come back to you with a feedback over the next few weeks after people listen to this conversation and see how they are approaching.
Thank you. Well, it's been wonderful to chat to you, and thank you for asking the right questions at the right time because that makes it much easier for me to give my story. Just to, again, remind people that all I'm interested in is the truth. And what I try to tell you is because I've read the literature over 40 years. And these are the conclusions I come to. And they may seem contentious and controversial, but they're steeped in science. And people who say, oh, but Noakes is controversial and so on. No, he's not. He acts like a scientist. And he tells you what he thinks the evidence shows. And I get frustrated when people who don't know anything about the literature become the experts and tell us the opposite and make judgments on everyone else's opinions.
Yeah, no, true. And I so agree with it. And we face this almost every day as well, where content comes from everywhere and almost everybody is a scientist by just reading it, the first two lines somewhere. And that's the whole purpose of this podcast. So it just keeps reiterating the fact that meaningful discussions are the right way to learn. And thank you so much for driving that today. I'm sure our listeners will value a great deal, sir.
Thank you. It's been a great privilege as always. I love the Indian personality,
Thank you. Like I said,
something about your warmth and friendliness that seems to be, all the Indian people I know are the same. And I'm sure it's the Hindu religion. And as I said, I'm a great follower of the Hindu religion. And that's the book I'm currently reading, The Four-Way Path.
Yeah. No, I think what you said is very right. There are a few things that we are blessed with, that is to be hospitable and respectful across the country in any religion for that matter. And we take great pride in our integrity of respecting. And so coming from you further makes us happier. And like I said earlier, if at all you plan to be in India at any point, please let us know. It will be a great pleasure to host you.
Thank you so very much. And again, it's been a wonderful hour. Thank you so much. And to your listeners, all the best in the future. And I hope the advice will help you secure your health for the future.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.